If the musicians themselves were to disappear physically from the covers of their records, their music and the themes they explored would remain, inspiring fantastic landscapes or surreal graphic compositions capable of surprising the viewer even more than the auditory content itself. Among the masters of this revolutionary tendency, two English artists stand out as the definitive architects of the visual imagination of the late 20th century. Progressive rock was a musical phenomenon that was fundamentally European, with origins tracing back to the final years of the 1960s. It represented something profoundly different from the established norms of the era. Different in its atmosphere, in the eclectic choice of instruments utilized, and perhaps most significantly, in the refusal of the musicians to appear as smiling idols on their own packaging. They rejected the tired cliches of the rock and roll star of the 1950s and early 60s, seeking instead to position themselves as serious artists. The message transmitted by this new movement was not strictly political or social in the traditional sense, but rather it was impregnated with fantasy, drawing heavily on the imaginary, the esoteric, and the irrational. The production and arrangements of these bands began to mix elements of high classical music, folk traditions, Baroque structures, and medieval scales, all while maintaining a foundational foot in jazz and rock. In essence, progressive bands introduced the concept of the album as a total work of art, leading many to adopt the label of art rock. This theatricality was not confined to their live performances. It manifested most evidently in their record sleeves. Authentic works of art that possessed a life of their own. Whether they were crafted through traditional painting, innovative photography, or a sophisticated combination of both. The man who first and most revolutionary redefined the concept of photography within this field was the English graphic designer Storm Thorgerson. His approach was one of total immersion. He did not simply take a photograph. He translated an invention of the ear into an invention of the eye. Thorgerson was known to listen to the music repeatedly, read the lyrics with the intensity of a literary critic, and converse with the musicians as much as possible to extract the core of their intent. He considered himself a translator of the subconscious, a pioneer of photographic manipulation. He was heavily influenced by the Surrealist and Modernist movements, citing figures such as Man Ray, René Magritte, Pablo Picasso, Wassily Kandinsky, and Juan Gris as his spiritual ancestors. Interestingly, despite his work being synonymous with high-concept imagery, he had very little sympathy for the advent of digital tools like Photoshop. He famously stated that he preferred the computer in his head to the one sitting on his desk. Born in 1944 and passing in 2013, Thorgerson became the author of some of the most iconic images in the history of music, the vast majority of them for Pink Floyd. In 1968, alongside his high school friend from Cambridge, Aubrey Powell, he founded Hipgnosis. This was a graphic design studio that specialized in creative imagery geared toward the music industry, and it would go on to change the aesthetic landscape of rock forever. The bond between Hipgnosis and Pink Floyd was not merely a business arrangement. It was rooted in the social fabric of the Cambridge underground. Thorgerson and Powell had known David Gilmour since their teenage years, and Thorgerson had attended the same art school as the band's original visionary, Syd Barrett, and its later conceptual leader, Roger Waters. It was for this reason that when the band was seeking to conceive the cover for their second album, A Saucerful of Secrets, released in 1968, they turned to the fledgling company. This would be the studio's first major commission. The Hipgnosis approach to design was based on the application of cinematic techniques to still photography. using airbrushing, multiple exposures, and physical collage to create surreal displacements and disturbing contrasts that fascinated the band. Powell and Thorgerson had been students of film, so it is no surprise that they treated their models like actors on a stage, creating photographs that possessed a distinctly theatrical and narrative form. Their covers rarely featured the faces of the artists, a choice that aligned with the prog rock ethos of mystery and the elevation of the work over the ego. Working with Pink Floyd seemed to grant them an extra layer of inspiration, and following the success of their early collaborations, the band entrusted them with the covers of nearly all their subsequent masterpieces, including Umaguma in 1969, Atom Heart Mother in 1970, and Wish You Were Here in 1975. However, the definitive moment for Hipgnosis and the history of the graphic arts arrived in 1973 with the release of The Dark Side of the Moon. The story of this cover has become a legend in its own right. Powell recalls meeting the band at Abbey Road Studios while they were still in the process of tracking the album. They already had the title, and the keyboardist, Richard Wright, made a specific request that challenged the designer's usual instincts. He told them not to come back with another surreal, high-concept photo collage. He asked for something elegant, clean, and graphic. The rest of the band agreed, leaving Thorgerson and Powell initially discouraged as they left the studio. They spent days agonizing over the request until Powell stumbled upon an old physics textbook that featured a photograph of a glass prism decomposing a beam of light into a rainbow. Thorgerson looked at the image and realized it was the perfect metaphor. Everything about Pink Floyd at that time was centered on their elaborate and revolutionary light shows, and the lyrics of the album touched on themes of ambition, madness, and the spectrum of human experience. The musicians were rarely seen or photographed. They were a presence felt through light and sound. The prism represented them perfectly when they presented the graphic design to the band at Abbey Road, placing the mock-ups on the floor. The musicians immediately exclaimed that this was exactly what they had in mind. It was a rare instance where a purely graphic symbol became more recognizable than the band itself, a testament to the power of minimalist translation. For another major project, Hipgnosis drew inspiration from the world of science fiction, specifically the novels of Arthur C. Clarke. This occurred during their collaboration with Led Zeppelin for the 1973 album Houses of the Holy. Powell was fascinated by the type of imagery that combined the ancient with the futuristic. He was a deep admirer of William Blake and Salvador Dali, and he sought to create a scene that felt like an esoteric ritual. The cover, featuring golden-haired children climbing the hexagonal basalt columns of the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, was a massive technical undertaking. Shortly after the band returned from a tour of Japan, Powell and Thorgerson met Jimmy Page at Victoria Station. They opened the trunk of their car to show him the results of their labor. Page, still in his stage clothes and smoking a cigarette, observed the projects with intense concentration. Within minutes, a crowd of over 200 people had gathered around the car, peeking at the artwork. Suddenly, the crowd began to applaud. It was in that moment, according to Powell, that they realized they had created something truly monumental. The image spoke to a collective unconscious, a sense of childhood's end that perfectly complemented the epic, sweeping nature of Zeppelin's music. In the years that followed, Thorgerson and Hipgnosis continued to push the boundaries of what was physically possible in a pre-digital age. They were masters of creating a world of illusions through puns, visual puzzles, and strange narratives, almost always set in vast, real-world landscapes occupied by people and objects in impossible situations. In 1975, they reached another creative peak with the cover for Wish You Were Here. The concept for the image was born during a discussion with the band about the inherent falseness of the music industry. At the time, artists who had been cheated or mistreated by managers would use the slang expression, "They burned me." Thorgerson, in his characteristic leap of logic, suggested they take the phrase literally. He proposed a cover featuring two businessmen shaking hands, with one of them caught in a literal blaze. This was not a trick of the darkroom. It was a physical reality. Powell and Thorgerson traveled to Los Angeles to meet with Ronnie Rondell, a professional stuntman willing to be set on fire for the shot. They conducted 15 takes, with Rondell wearing a flame-retardant suit beneath a business suit, his head protected by a wig that was ignited as the cameras rolled. On the final take, the wind shifted, blowing the flames into Rondell's face and singeing his mustache. The stuntman famously declared that he was done and would never do such a thing again. But the resulting image, a man burning while maintaining a polite corporate gesture, became the definitive critique of the machine that Pink Floyd was fighting against. The creative odyssey of Hipgnosis did not end there. In 1977, for the cover of the album Animals, they conceived one of the most ambitious stunts in London's history. Roger Waters had come up with the idea of a pig flying over the Battersea Power Station, an industrial monolith that symbolized the pigs, dogs, and sheep of his lyrical social hierarchy. Thorgerson and Powell commissioned the construction of a 40-foot inflatable pig, nicknamed Algae, and arranged for it to be tethered between two of the station's massive chimneys. On the second day of shooting, the high winds caused the pig to break its moorings. It drifted upward, disappearing into the clouds and entering the flight path of Heathrow Airport, causing a major aviation alert. Pilots reported seeing a giant flying pig over the city. And for a few hours, the surrealism of Hipgnosis was no longer confined to a record sleeve. It had invaded the reality of millions of Londoners. The pig eventually landed in a farmer's field in Kent, and Algae was recovered to accompany Pink Floyd on their subsequent world tour. This incident perfectly encapsulated the Hipgnosis philosophy that art should be a physical intervention in the world, a manifestation of the impossible made tangible. The legacy of Thorgerson and Powell lies in their absolute refusal to compromise. They insisted on the brutality of fact, believing that a photograph of something real, no matter how bizarre, carried a weight that no painting or digital manipulation could ever replicate. Their work provided a bridge between the listener and the music, creating a space where the imagination could wander before the needle even touched the groove. They understood that, in the world of progressive rock, the album cover was the front door to a cathedral of sound. By removing the band members from the frame, they allowed the listener to inhabit the music more fully. They proved that a pop product could be a vessel for profound philosophical reflection and surrealist exploration. In an age where music has become a digital stream, the physical artifacts created by Hipgnosis remain as tombstones of an era when art was massive, dense, and physically dangerous to create. They taught us that if you listen closely enough, you can see the sound. And if you look closely enough at the image, you can hear the soul of the band. Through the handshake of a burning man or the silent stare of a cow in a field, Hipgnosis redefined what it meant to see music, leaving behind a gallery of illusions that continue to haunt and inspire generations of artists and dreamers.